I think I really need this, do I? I'm going to put it on anyway. Some stupid Apple ad. Yes. Oh, Apple and Vodafone. Yes. Oh, sitting on the cable. Let's hang that up there. This is going to squeak. Squeak. I wonder if anyone's going to watch. It should be interesting. So, let me grab my blanket as well. Of course. What the hell? I want to grab my blanket. Just in case the chat doesn't come over there. So here is my beautiful fluffy blanket. That's going in my lap. This is my starting soon screen, really. Oh, that's better. The font's a bit better, so I can actually read the chat. I'm still in denial about needing glasses. I definitely need glasses, but I am... yes. I don't know which screen to go into, really. Maybe this one. Do I need the keyboard? I need the blanket. Do I even need the blanket? Yes. Yes, I need the blanket. But first, that thing is green, so that's good. I like green. Right. I think I'm going to read it on the same screen as I've got it. Yeah. So I can, yeah. I can scroll this in the background and I can still read it, so that's good. But anyway, so nice to be able to start early. It's like 20 past 11. I never start this early. It's nice. And coffee. Yes. Coffee. Well, it's the end of my Courvoisier. And there, in the background, you can just about see it there, is the HMS Beagle. Yes. Yes. So this is what we're going to be reading today. Chapter 1, Variation Under Domestication. And, yeah, you should be able to follow along now. As I think last time for my introduction, it wasn't possible for you to actually see what I was seeing, because I had the browser in the background. So if you click on the link in the description, this is where it'll take you. It's a Project Gutenberg book, which means it's It's in the public domain. Yes. Yes. Well, I don't need to see that, do I? So, chapter 1, variation under domestication. So we have causes of variation. So this is like a kind of mini individual table of contents for each chapter. So we have like, let's see if I can jump back. So we have this. So we have like the contents, table of contents, or list of chapters, plus the index and the introduction. And then we've got a detailed contents. So there's the chapter heading and a list of, I don't know, what could you call them? Sub-chapters. And then you've got the chapters themselves. But at the beginning of each chapter, so here we go, chapter 1, we have this, where's my mouse? There's my mouse. So we have like that, but it doesn't, there aren't markings within the chapter to tell you where that finishes. So we've got that's the first kind of sub chapter, if you like, of chapter 1. Oh no, that's I've selected 2. So causes of variability. So is that just, I can see variability here in the second paragraph, which is quite long. And then the third paragraph, there's sterility has been said to be saying the bane of horticulture. But the next one is effects of habit. So that would have been good, I think, if this kind of massive wall of text could have been divided up a bit, and these subheadings could actually have been placed into the main text of the chapter. So I am disappointed about that, because then it would help to like break it up a little bit, and you could then see more clearly where one kind of subsection was ending. But I don't know, maybe just either he thought of it afterwards. So here's this paragraph starting, the laws governing inheritance are quite unknown. And then, all right, somewhere here I expect there'd be something about inheritance. There we go. Inheritance. So we know that these correspond to either one paragraph or multiple paragraphs, but there's no one-to-one, like we have this many subchapters and therefore this many paragraphs. No, it doesn't. I wish it did work like that. That would make it much, much easier. Anyway, I'm not going to start just yet, because I just want to read this. So I'm going to stream it anyway. And then it's going to go on YouTube, unedited. So I'm sorry, YouTubers. It's going to be a bit rambling and, I'm going to be stopping to muse on certain sentences or words or ideas, kind of stepping back and just wondering. And we shall see. We shall see. But I suppose I could start before I finished my coffee. Because normally if I'm playing a game, I need to use my hands for either the keyboard and mouse or a controller, or both hands really. So I have to put the coffee down, whereas reading does not require me to use my hands. I mean, I can scroll every now and then, but I don't have to keep my hand on it. I can keep my hand warm as well. Anyhow, so let's have a look at these sub-chapters. Here we've got causes of variability, effects of habit, a correlation of growth, inheritance, character of domestic varieties, difficulty of distinguishing between varieties and species. Oh, that'll be interesting. What does he mean by that? Origin of domestic varieties from one or more species, domestic pigeons, their differences and origin, principle of selection anciently followed, its effects. Should that have been a semicolon? Methodical and unconscious selection, unknown origin. There was a good recent movie called Unknown Origin. Anyway, digressing. Unknown origin of our domestic productions. Mainly because it was Katie Sackhoff. Circumstances favourable to man's power of selection. Okay. Yeah, she's stuck on this spaceship and then there's this AI. Alright. Alright then, I am starting. When we look to the individuals, so you can see this. I'm going to highlight the paragraph that I'm reading. I don't know if that makes it easier to read, but that's what I'll do. Some of them are really long, so I'll fill up the whole page. When we look to the individuals of the same variety or sub-variety of our older cultivated plants and animals, one of the first points which strikes us is that they generally differ much from each other than do the individuals of any one species or variety in a state of nature. When we reflect on the vast diversity of plants and animals which have been cultivated, and which are varied during all ages under the most different climates and treatment, I think we are driven to conclude that this greater variability is simply due to our domestic productions having been raised under conditions of life not so uniform as, somewhat different from, those to which the parent species have been exposed under nature. There is also, I think, some probability in the view propounded by Andrew Knight, I'll have to look him up, I guess, that this variability may be partly connected with excess of food. Okay, so plants and animals. it seems pretty clear that organic beings must be exposed during several generations to the new conditions of life to cause any appreciable amount of variation, and that when the organization has once begun to vary, it generally continues to vary for many generations. No case is on record of a variable being ceasing to be variable under cultivation. Our oldest cultivated plants, such as wheat, still often yield new varieties. Our oldest domesticated animals are still capable of rapid improvement or modification. So, older cultivated plants and animals. And one of the first points which strikes us is that they generally differ much more from each other than do the individuals of any one species or variety in a state of nature. So, we are making a distinction between natural generations and differences that arise from generation to generation, and then I don't know if you'd call it no, he's calling it domesticated. So where man has interfered in the breeding process. It's something I haven't noticed before, the way the wire kind of hangs. Okay, our oldest cultivated plants, such as wheat, still often yield new varieties. Okay, so let's, I think I'm going to leave the Andrew Knight. It's going to be too distracting. Let's go on to the second paragraph. Second paragraph. I don't know if this will get covered. Yep. Okay, so that's a good magnification for both of us, I think. We should be able to read that, and I'm reading it. It has been disputed at what period of life the causes of variability, whatever they may be, generally act, whether during the early or late period of development of the embryo, or at the instant of conception. Geoffrey St. Hilaire's experiment showed that the unnatural treatment of the embryo causes monstrosities, and monstrosities cannot be separated by any clear line of distinction from mere variations. But I am strongly inclined to suspect that the most frequent cause of variability may be attributed to the male and female reproductive elements having been affected prior to the act of conception. Of course, he didn't know about meiosis back then. So, prior to the act of conception, several reasons make me believe in this, but the chief one is the remarkable effect which confinement or cultivation has on the functions of the reproductive system. This system appearing to be far more susceptible than any other part of the organization to the action of any change in the conditions of life. Nothing is more easy than to tame an animal, is it? And few things more difficult than to get it to breed freely under confinement. So he's saying it's easy to tame it, but difficult to breed it. Even in the many cases when the male and female unite, many animals there are which will not breed, though living long under not very close confinement in their native country. This is generally attributed to vitiated instincts. But how many cultivated plants display the utmost vigour, and yet rarely or never seed? In some few such cases, it has been found out that the that very trifling changes, such as a little more or less water at some particular period of growth, will determine whether or not the plant sets a seed. I cannot here enter into the copious details which I have collected on this curious subject, but to show how singular the laws are which determine the reproduction of plants under confinement, I may just mention that carnivorous animals, even from the tropics, breed in this country pretty freely under confinement, with the exception of the plantigrades, or bear family. Whereas carnivorous birds, with the rarest exceptions, hardly ever lay fertile eggs. Many exotic plants have pollen utterly worthless, in the same exact condition as in the most sterile hybrids. When, on the one hand, we see domesticated animals and plants, though often weak and sickly, yet breeding quite freely under confinement, and when, on the other hand, we see individuals, though taken young from a state of nature, perfectly tamed, long-lived, and healthy, of which I could give numerous instances, yet having their reproductive systems so seriously affected by unperceived causes as to fail in acting, we need not be surprised at this system when it does act under confinement, acting not quite regularly, and producing offspring not perfectly like their parents, or variable. So, under confinement, I think that was the main import. The chief one is the remarkable effect which confinement or cultivation has on the functions of the reproductive system. I think that's pretty much all there was in that paragraph. All right, let's move on to the next one. So I don't think I'll muse very much there. Sterility has been said to be the bane of horticulture, but on this view we owe variability to the same cause which produces sterility, and variability is the source of all the choicest productions of the garden. I may add that as some organisms will breed most freely under the most unnatural conditions, for instance, the rabbit and ferret kept in hutches, showing that their reproductive system has not been thus affected, so will some animals and plants withstand domestication or cultivation, and vary very slightly, perhaps hardly more than in a state of nature. Okay, so he's talking about the reproductive system and saying that under domestication or cultivation, it doesn't work the same as it does in nature. And it's generally more difficult to breed them. So it's easy to tame them, but difficult to tame them. All right. A long list could easily be given of sporting plants. What does he mean by sporting plants? As in sporting, a jolly good sport, I'm guessing that. By this term, gardeners mean a single bud or offset, which usually assumes a new and sometimes very different character from that of the rest of the plant. So not that then. Such buds can be propagated by grafting, etc., and sometimes seed. These sports are extremely rare under nature, but far from rare under cultivation. And in this case, we see that the treatment of the parent has affected a bud or offset, and not the ovules or pollen. But it is the opinion of most physiologists that there is no essential difference between a bud and an ovule in the earlier stages of formation, so that, in fact, sports support my view that variability may be largely attributed to the ovules or pollen, or both, having been affected by the treatment of the parent prior to the act of conception. Prior to the act of conception. These cases anyhow show that variation is not necessarily connected, as some authors have supposed, with the act of generation. Something I missed there. Okay, so sporting means a single bud or offset which suddenly assumes a new and sometimes very different character from that of the rest of the plant. Okay, these sports are extremely rare under nature, but far from rare under cultivation. So we're still like comparing a natural kind of series of generations to domesticated breeding or generations, cross-pollination. But it is the opinion of most physiologists that there is no essential difference between a bud and an ovule in their earlier stages of formation, so that in fact sports support my view that variability may be largely attributed to the ovules or pollen, or to both. Plain he. Hello there. Hang on. There we go. Just had to adjust my cushion. How are you today? And a happy new year. I am reading from Darwin's Origin of Species. And rather than just reading, I'm stopping to kind of pause and muse and hopefully understand what's going on. I'm not rushing through it. Me, I'm good. I've done all my morning routine, so I managed to start streaming a little bit earlier. My pronunciation is really good. Oh, thank you. I like to read aloud, so I thought, why not just stream it as well? So yeah, instead of playing a game, I thought, I'll do this. Okay, so when I did the introduction, I didn't have this visible, so there were a few people watching, and they couldn't follow along, so I'm highlighting now the paragraph I'm reading, so you can see what I'm reading as well. Seedlings from the same fruit and the young of the same litter sometimes differ considerably from each other, though both the young and the parents, as Müller has remarked, who is Müller, have apparently been exposed to exactly the same conditions of life, and this shows how unimportant the direct effects of the conditions of life are in comparison with the laws of reproduction, and of growth, and of inheritance. For had the action of the conditions been direct, if any of the young had varied, all would probably have varied in the same manner, to judge how much. In the case of any variation, we should attribute to the direct action of heat, moisture, light, food, etc. Most difficult. My impression is that with animals, such agencies have produced very little direct effect, though apparently more in the case of plants. Under this point of view, Mr. Buckman's recent experiments on plants seem extremely valuable. So I guess these are, like Müller and Buckman, they are contemporary scientists. When all or nearly all of the individuals exposed to certain conditions are affected in the same way, the change at first appears to be directly due to such conditions. But in some cases it can be shown that quite opposite conditions produced similar changes of structure. Nevertheless, some slight amount of change may, I think, be attributed to the direct action of the conditions of life, as, in some cases, increased size from amount of food, colour from particular kinds of food and from light, and perhaps the thickness of fur from climate. So what is he talking about there? Seedlings from the same fruit and the young of the same litter sometimes differ considerably from each other. Okay. So let's say a cat has a litter of 6 kittens. I don't know how many kittens cats have. But though both the young and the parents have apparently been exposed to exactly the same conditions of life, and this shows how unimportant the direct effects of the conditions of life are in comparison with the laws of reproduction and of growth and of inheritance. For had the action of the conditions been direct, if any of the young had varied, all would probably have varied in the same manner. Hurley, go poop. Remember you. Bro, go to sleep. You said the same thing last time. You look like you haven't slept in months. I don't think you can. Is it possible not to sleep for months? I think it's like, is it possible for like a week? I think a week is probably the maximum you can go without sleeping. It's this, is it? I don't know if you're still here. You're probably gone. Okay. Habit has also decided influence, as in the period of flowering with plants when transported from one climate to another. In animals, it has a more marked effect. For instance, I find in the domestic duck that the bones of the wing weigh less and the bones of the leg more, in proportion to the whole skeleton, than do the same bones in the wild duck. Okay, so he's comparing the domestic duck with the wild duck, and I presume that this change may be safely attributed to the domestic duck flying much less and walking more than its wild parent. I think the word wild, for me, seems a better way of describing domestic compared, because the other one is natural. 7 days was the record, I think. Guy said he was going insane. This is The Origin of Species, Charles Darwin. So, he is he's weighing up the skeleton of a wild duck compared to a domestic duck, and seeing how they develop in nature, so wild, without any human interference, and also like farm ducks, I guess. The great and inherited development of the udders in cows and goats in countries where they are habitually milked, in comparison with the state of these organs in other countries, is another instance of the effect of use. I guess in the wild, the udders, like people aren't milking the cows, it's only the baby cows. That's what milk is for the baby goats and the baby cows. So, but generation after generation, I suppose, in comparison with the state of these organs in other countries, is another instant of the effect of use. Not a single domestic animal can be named which has not, in some country, drooping ears. Hang on, he's gone off udders now into drooping ears. And the view suggested by some authors that the drooping is due to the disuse of the muscles of the ear, from the animals not being much alarmed by danger, seems probable. Okay, so we're still on this domestic animals and plants versus wild animals and plants. I think I prefer the word wild as in natural. That seems easier. I really wished, like at the beginning, don't know, you didn't see me doing this before, but at the beginning there's like a little mini table of contents, but the actual chapter isn't divided up. So we don't know where it goes from like one subheading into the next one. He's just a duck bone collector. Ah, there was a movie back in, when was it, 2000? I think it was Denzel Washington, and he's in a hospital bed, and he's kind of almost dying, and he's some kind of forensic scientist. The bone collector. It's just reminded me of that, and he's pitched against some kind of serial killer, but he managed to solve the mystery from his hospital bed. The bone collector. He would be arrested if he were doing this now. I think there are scientists doing more crazy stuff now. Yes, and if you think back, this was written back in 1856. You know, this is what really blew religion out of the water. But there's, modern day backlash. The last statistic I read was like half of the US actually believes in creationism. It's like, come on, we're in the 21st century and you kind of believe in that crap? So you got to remember, at the time, people actually believed that things just spontaneously appeared. There were no humans, and then there were humans. And he solved it from all these observations and collecting data and measuring and comparisons. There are many laws regulating variation. And of course the style of writing is Victorian, and also whatever scientific turn of phrase was in vogue at the time, so there's that. There are many laws regulating variation. some few of which can be dimly seen and will be hereafter briefly mentioned. I will here only allude to what may be called correlation of growth. Any change in the embryo or larva will almost certainly entail changes in the mature animal. In monstrosities, the correlations between quite distinct parts are very curious, and many instances are given in Isidore Geoffrey St. Hilaire's great work on the subject. Okay, I guess we're meant to be familiar with that. Isidore Geoffrey St. Hilaire. I think I'll look that up in a second. Breeders believe that long limbs are almost always accompanied with an elongated head. Breeders of what? Any animal or all animals? Some instances of correlation are quite whimsical. Thus, cats with blue eyes are invariably deaf. Okay. Color and constitutional peculiarities go together, of which many remarkable cases could be given amongst animals and plants. From the facts collected by Heusinger, it appears that white sheep and pigs are differently affected from colored individuals by certain vegetable poisons. Hairless dogs have imperfect teeth. Long-haired and coarse-haired animals are apt to have, as is asserted, long or many horns. Many horns. What, more than 2? Pigeons with feathered feet have skin between their outer toes. Pigeons with short beaks have small feet, and those with long beaks large feet. Hence, if man goes on selecting, and thus augmenting any peculiarity, he will almost certainly unconsciously modify other parts of the structure, owing to the mysterious laws of the correlation of growth. Okay. Who is this Isidore? Who's this Isidore chap? I have to look this guy up. I have to write, so Isidore Geoffrey St. Hilaire. Okay, so who is this? Isidore Geoffrey St. Hilaire was a French zoologist and an authority on the deviation from normal structure. So the book was published in 1856. And died, so he died soon after the publication of The Origin of Species. Right, so we're meant to know this. Or Darwin is expecting us to know this, chappie. Right then. Isidore St. Hilaire. He was born in Paris, and it is showed an aptitude for mathematics, but eventually he devoted himself to the study of natural history and of medicine. He conducted investigations of too far away, hermaphroditism, and is credited with introducing the term tetralogy. Okay, so what is his main? As an authority on the deviation from normal structure. All right. So here he's talking about how there's a correlation between certain parts or certain aspects of the animal. So long-haired and coarse-haired animals are apt to have, as is asserted, long or many horns. So are the correlations true? And he says instances of correlation are quite whimsical. He still doesn't say if the correlations between quite distinct parts are very curious. Okay, curious, whimsical, but what kind of bearing does that have on the rest of this argument? Okay, there are many laws regulating variation, some few of which can be dimly seen and will be hereafter briefly mentioned. I will here only allude to what may be called correlation of growth. Okay, so it's a little bit of an aside, I think. A slight digression. All right, next paragraph. The next paragraph. The result of the various quite unknown or dimly seen laws of variation is infinitely complex and diversified. It is well worthwhile carefully to study the several treatises published on some of our old cultivated plants, as to the hyacinth, potato, or even the dahlia, etc. And it is really surprising to note the endless points in structure and constitution in which the varieties and sub-varieties differ from each other. The whole organization seems to have become plastic and tends to depart in some small degree from that of the parental type. All right, so the whole organization seems to have become plastic and tends to depart in some small degree from that of the parental type. The result of the various quite unknown or dimly seen laws of variation. Okay, so he's trying to make a connection between what he's observing and whether there's some law governing this. And what's he saying? It's infinitely complex and diversified. It is well worthwhile carefully to study the several treatises published on some of our old cultivated plants. Okay, and why? And it is really surprising to note the endless points in structure and constitution in which the varieties differ slightly from each other. And what is his definition of slightly? Some small degree. Okay, so from the parental type. All right, I think I'm going to leave that. So there's variation. Oh, some stupid messages come up, which I don't want to deal with. Duck bone. Any variation which is not inherited is unimportant for us. Now we're getting on to inheritance. So we got variation so far from generation to generation. But then that variation that has happened between one or more generations, but the number and diversity of inheritable deviations of structure, both those of slight and those of considerable physiological importance, is endless. Any variation which is not inherited is unimportant for us. But the number and diversity of inheritable deviations of structure, both those of slight and those of considerable physiological importance, is endless. Endless. Dr. Prosper Lucas's treatise, in 2 large volumes, is the fullest and the best on this subject. No breeder doubts how strong is the tendency to inheritance. Like produces like is his fundamental belief. Doubts have been thrown on this principle by theoretical writers alone. When a deviation appears not unfrequently, and we see it in the father and the child, we cannot tell whether it may not be due to the same original cause, acting on both. But when amongst individuals apparently exposed to the same conditions, any very rare deviation due to some extraordinary combinations of circumstances appears in the parent, say, once amongst several million individuals, and it reappears in the child, the mere doctrine of chances almost compels us to attribute its reappearance to inheritance. Everyone must have heard of cases of albinism, prickly skin, hairy bodies, etc., appearing in several members of the same family. If strange and rare deviations of structure are truly inherited, less strange truly inherited. If strange and rare deviations of structure are truly inherited, less strange and commoner deviations may be freely admitted to be inheritable. Perhaps the correct way of viewing the whole subject would be to look at the inheritance of every character, whatever, as the rule, and non-inheritance as the anomaly. Oh, hang on. I've knocked this off a bit, I think. There we go. There we go. So, it's gone on to inheriting, so it's variations to start with, and how these changes happen both bred by humans or in the wild. And then there's big changes and small changes. I'm calling them changes, but it's a variation of that, whatever is being bred. And then he's gone on to, and it reappears in the child. The mere doctrine of chances almost compels us to attribute its reappearance to inheritance. Everyone must have heard of cases of albinism, prickly skin, hairy bodies appearing in several members of the same family. If strange and rare deviations of structure are truly inherited, less strange and commoner deviations may be freely admitted to be inheritable. Perhaps the correct way of viewing the whole subject would be to look at inheritance of every character, whatever, as the rule, and non-inheritance as the anomaly. I guess maybe that was not known then, but it somehow seems sort of obvious to me, but perhaps at the time it wasn't. I mean, I would tend to assume that whatever characters we have, we pass on. I mean, talk about humans, but any plant or animal would pass on everything. But then I know about genetics and he did not. So he's just observing he's trying to figure stuff out from the data he's collected. Okay then. The laws governing inheritance are quite unknown. No one can say why the same peculiarity in different individuals of the same species and in individuals of different species is sometimes inherited and sometimes not so. Why the child often reverts in certain characters to its grandfather or grandmother or other much more remote ancestor. Why a peculiarity is often transmitted from one sex to both sexes or to one sex alone, more commonly but not exclusively to the like sex. It is a fact of some little importance to us that peculiarities appearing in the males of our domestic breeds are often transmitted either exclusively or in a much greater degree to males alone. A much more important rule, which I think may be trusted, is that at whatever period of life a peculiarity first appears, it tends to appear in the offspring at a corresponding age, though sometimes earlier. In many cases, this could not be otherwise. Thus, the inherited peculiarities in the horns of cattle could appear only in the offspring when nearly mature. Peculiarities in the silkworm are known to appear at the corresponding caterpillar or cocoon stage. But hereditary diseases and some other facts that make me believe that the rule has a wider extension, and that when there is no apparent reason why a peculiarity should appear at any particular stage, yet that it does tend to appear in the offspring at the same period at which it appeared in the parent. I believe this rule to be of the highest importance in explaining the laws of embryology. These remarks are, of course, confined to the first appearance of the peculiarity and not to its primary cause, which may have acted on the ovules or male element. In nearly the same manner as in the crossed offspring from a short-horned cow by a long-horned bull, the greater length of horn, though appearing late in life, is clearly due to the male element. Okay, so peculiarities that are inherited but sometimes jump generations. So we may have seen it in a great-grandparent, and then we don't see it again, and then there it is again. And what else? That it may have appeared prior to the embryo forming. The laws of embryology. These remarks are of course confined to the first appearance of the peculiarity, not to its primary cause, which he was alluding to before, and more about conception rather than the formation of the embryo. So it's already been set. Okay, next paragraph. I'm thinking probably 2 hours. Who knows? Anyway, I'm going to continue because I want to. Having alluded to the subject of reversion, I may here refer to a statement often made by naturalists, namely, that our domestic varieties, when run wild, gradually but certainly revert in character to their aboriginal stocks. Hence, it has been argued that no deductions can be drawn from domestic races to species in a state of nature. it has been argued that no deductions can be drawn from domestic races to species in a state of nature. I have in vain endeavoured to discover on what decisive facts the above statement has so often and so boldly been made. There would be great difficulty in proving its truth. We may safely conclude that very many of the most strongly marked domestic varieties could not possibly live in a wild state. In many cases, we do not know what the aboriginal stock was, and so could not tell whether or not nearly perfect reversion has ensued. It would be quite necessary, in order to prevent the effects of intercrossing, that only a single variety should be turned loose in its new home. Nevertheless, as our varieties certainly do occasionally revert, in some of their characters, to ancestral forms, it seems to me not improbable that if we could succeed in naturalizing, or were to cultivate during many generations the several races, for instance, of the cabbage, in very poor soil, in which case, however, some effect would have to be attributed to the direct action of the poor soil, that they would to a large extent, or even wholly, revert to the wild aboriginal stock. Whether or not the experiment would succeed is not of great importance for our line of argument, for by the experiment itself the conditions of life are changed. If it could be shown that our domestic varieties manifested a strong tendency to reversion, that is, to lose their acquired characters whilst kept under unchanged conditions, and whilst kept in a considerable body so that free intercrossing might check, by blending together any slight deviations of structure, in such case, I grant that we could deduce nothing from domestic varieties in regard to species. But there is not a shadow of evidence in favour of this view to assert that we could not breed our cart and race horses, long and short-horned cattle, and poultry of various breeds, and esculent vegetables, for an almost infinite number of generations, would be opposed to all experience. I may add that when under nature the conditions of life do change, variations and reversions of character probably do occur, but natural selection, as will hereafter be explained, will determine how far the new characters thus arising shall be preserved. Okay, so as I know about genetics, and he does not, the way I'm looking at this is that whether these characters appear in the coming generation is part of that genetic sequence. So what he's calling reversion, I would probably call a reappearance. So if you go 10 generations back, then you've got the longhorn, and then each subsequent generation doesn't have it, but then it's still on that chromosome, but then it's being competing with its allele, and then at some point it shows up again. So unless in the the gamete kind of loses it and it's cut out of it, I mean, it depends on what kind of reproduction it goes through. but he's talking about cabbages and cows and horses. Well, cows and horses are sexual reproduction, and sexual means splitting the chromosome in half. Okay, so I kind of, instead of the word reversion, I think I would use reappearance. But he's kind of saying that, could we, say, breed the cabbage in the same way and sort of replicate what the wild cabbage is doing? Could we recreate the same circumstances and environment for the domestic cabbage and then keep breeding it? For by the experiment itself, conditions of life are changed, so we'll never get it exactly the same. It seems to be not improbable that if we could succeed in naturalizing, or were to cultivate during many generations of several races of the cabbage in very poor soil, revert to the wild aboriginal stock. So if we go back and back and back to the point where humans took the wild cabbage and started to cultivate it, but if we then had a separate scientific farm and just cultivated the cabbage, but as though it were in the wild, would it then revert to exhibit the characteristics of the wild cabbage? But he's saying the fact that we've taken it out would make it different. I think nowadays, though, we could test the soil, that we could replicate those conditions more closely than whatever 200 years ago. So maybe we could do it now. And maybe someone has done that experiment that he is talking about, or here just using as a thought experiment and an argumentative structure. Okay, next paragraph. I should have counted how many. Okay, I'm sort of slipping down here. When we look to the hereditary varieties or races of our domestic animals and plants, and compare them with species closely allied together, we generally perceive in each domestic race, as already remarked, less uniformity of character than in true races, in true species. Domestic races of the same species also often have a somewhat monstrous character, by which I mean that, although differing from each other, and from the other species of the same genus, in several trifling respects, they often differ in an extreme degree in some one part, both when compared with one another, and more especially when compared with all the species in nature to which they are nearest allied. With these exceptions, and with that of the perfect fertility of varieties when crossed, a subject hereafter to be discussed, domestic races in the same species differ from each other in the same manner as, only in most cases in a lesser degree than, do closely allied species of the same genus in a state of nature. Now, he hasn't defined the word genus. Naughty. I think this must be admitted when we find that there are hardly any domestic races, either amongst animals or plants, which have not been ranked by some competent judges as mere varieties, and by other competent judges as the descendants of aboriginally distinct species. If any marked distinction existed between domestic races and species, this source of doubt could not so perpetually recur. It has been stated that domestic races do not differ from each other in characters of generic value. I think it could be shown that this statement is hardly correct. But naturalists differ most widely in determining what characters are of generic value, all such valuations being at present empirical. Moreover, on the view of the origin of genera, which I shall presently give, good. We have no right to expect often to meet with generic differences in our domesticated productions. Okay, so I want to know what is the meaning of genus. Genus. What is a genus? Aha. The hierarchy of biological classification's 8 major taxonomic ranks. A family contains one or more genera. Intermediate minor rankings are not shown. Aha. So he talked about family and he talked about genus. So a genus and plural genera. So he used these terms without defining them. A genus, plural genera. Yes, we come back and here. So generic meaning genera. No, here we go. Moreover, on the view of the origin of genera, which I shall presently give, we have no right to expect often to meet with generic differences in our domesticated productions. And earlier on, he's using the word genus, but he is not defining it. So either we're expected to know or he'll define it later. So is this written really for other biologists, or is it just for everyday people? It seems to me only other biologists can really read it. He's talking about other scientists, and we're expected to know them. So, there we go. Species. Species is the... this is at the bottom end. So life, domain, kingdom, then phylum, then class, then order, family, genus, species. All right. In the hierarchy of biological classification, genus comes above species and below family. In binomial nomenclature, the genus name forms the first part of the binomial species name for each species within the genus. Binomial nomenclature. So this is taxonomy. So what is taxonomy? It's a sort of categorization, classification. In biology, taxonomy is the scientific study of naming, defining, circumscribing, and classifying groups of biological organisms based on shared characteristics. Organisms are grouped into taxa. I haven't heard that word before. And these groups are given a taxonomic rank. I guess this is the rank. Intermediate minor rankings are not shown. So there's other ones in between this. Blimey. Let's make this a bit bigger. No? File. Ah. Okay. So that's genus. All right. Okay. Got it. Don't want to go into too much detail about biological classifications. All right. Next paragraph. Moving on. Deselected. Okay. When we attempt to estimate the amount of structural difference between the domestic race of the same species, we are soon involved in doubt, from not knowing whether they have descended from one or several parent species. This point, if it could be cleared up, would be interesting. If, for instance, it could be shown that the greyhound, bloodhound, terrier, spaniel, and bulldog, which we all know propagate their kind so truly, were the offspring of any single species, then such facts would have great weight in making us doubt about the immutability of the many very closely allied and natural species. For instance, of the many foxes inhabiting different quarters of the world. I do not believe, as we shall presently see, that all our dogs have descended from any one wild species. But in the case of some other domestic races, there is presumptive or even strong evidence in favor of this view. Hopefully he's going to share the evidence. Okay. It has often been assumed that man has chosen for domestication animals and plants having an extraordinary inherent tendency to vary. It has often been assumed, and likewise to withstand diverse climates. I do not dispute that these capacities have added largely to the value of most of our domesticated productions. But how could a savage possibly know, when he first tamed an animal, whether it would vary in succeeding generations, and whether it would endure other climates? Has the little variability of the ass or guinea fowl, or the small power of endurance of warmth by the reindeer, or of cold by the common camel, prevented their domestication? I cannot doubt that if other animals and plants equal in number to our domesticated productions, and belonging to equally diverse classes and countries, were taken from a state of nature, and could be made to breed for an equal number of generations under domestication, they would vary on an average as largely as the parent species of our existing domesticated productions have varied. It kind of seems obvious. But it has often been assumed that man has chosen them. I guess this is looking in retrospect, that because this happened, this was deliberate. But he's saying, well, but how could a savage possibly know when he first tamed an animal whether it would vary in succeeding generations? He just tamed it, and then the variation occurred, and then he saw it, and then someone else saw it and said, well, he must have done it deliberately, but no. Okay, then. In the case of most of our anciently domesticated animals and plants, I do not think it is possible to come to any definite conclusion whether they have descended from one or several species. So species can interbreed, I suppose. Largely okay. The argument mainly relied on by those who believe in the multiple origin of our domestic animals is that we find in the most ancient records, more especially on the monuments of Egypt, much diversity in the breeds, and that some of the breeds closely resemble, perhaps, are identical with those still existing. Even if this latter fact were found more strictly and generally true, than seems to me to be the case, what does it show but that some of our breeds originated there 4,000 or 5,000 years ago? But Mr. Horner's researches have rendered it in some degree probable that man sufficiently civilized to have manufactured pottery existed in the valley of the Nile 13,000 or 14,000 years ago. And who will pretend to say how long before these ancient periods savages, like those of Tierra del Fuego or Australia, who possess a semi-domestic dog, may not have existed in Egypt? Who is Mr. Horner? We do not know. So it's the style seems to be very much a kind of thinking out loud. In the case, or like his talking to an audience kind of thing. In the case of most of our anciently domesticated animals and plants, I do not think it is possible to come to any definite conclusion whether they have descended from one or more several species. The argument mainly relied on by those who believe in the multiple origin of our domestic animals is that we find the most ancient records, more especially in the monuments of Egypt. Which monuments? Pyramids? Can't think of any other monuments in Egypt. So he's looking at the hieroglyphics and saying, well, they look kind of the same as, but in terms of evolution, I mean, 13 or 14,000 years is not really that long, is it? The whole subject must, I think, remain vague. Nevertheless, I may, without here entering on any details, state that, from geographical and other considerations, I think it highly probable that our domestic dogs have descended from several wild species. So, is it a single dog or a single hierarchy of dogs, or is it the multiple origin? In regard to sheep and goats, I can form no opinion. I should think, from facts communicated to me by Mr. Blythe. Again, Mr. Blythe is not really identified. I'm assuming he's a scientist. On the habits, voice, constitution of the humped Indian cattle, that these had descended from a different aboriginal stock from our European cattle. And several competent judges believe that these latter have had more than one wild parent. With respect to horses, from reasons which I cannot give here, I am doubtfully inclined to believe, in opposition to several authors, that all the races have descended from one wild stock. Mr. Blythe, whose opinion, from his large and varied stores of knowledge, I should value more than that of almost anyone, thinks that the breeds of poultry have proceeded from the common wild Indian fowl, Gallus bankiva, In regard to ducks and rabbits, the breeds of which differ considerably from each other in structure, I do not doubt they have all descended from the common wild duck and rabbit. I do not doubt. Okay, but where is the evidence? Oh, very long paragraph coming up. All right. So we're talking about single inheritance or multiple inheritance, inherited from multiple parents, multiple species, or single species. So that is the sort of musing going on here. The doctrine of the origin of our several domestic races from several aboriginal stocks. So now he's using a different word. So he's used natural, wild, and now aboriginal. I guess aboriginal gives more of a sense of ancestral, has been carried to an absurd extreme by some authors. They believe that every race which breeds true, let the distinctive characters be ever so slight, has had its wild prototype. At this rate, there must have existed at least a score of species of wild cattle, as many sheep, and several goats in Europe alone, and several even within Great Britain. One author believes that there formerly existed in Great Britain 11 wild species of sheep, peculiar to it. When we bear in mind that Britain has now hardly one peculiar mammal, and France has few distinct from those of Germany, and conversely, and so much with Hungary, Spain, etc., but that each of these kingdoms possesses several peculiar breeds of cattle, sheep, etc. We must admit that many domestic breeds have originated in Europe. For whence could they have been derived, as these several countries do not possess a number of peculiar species as distinct parent stocks? So it is in India, even in the case of the domestic dogs of the whole world, which I fully admit have probably descended from several wild species. I cannot doubt that there has been an immense amount of inherited variation. Who can believe that animals closely resembling the Italian greyhound, the bloodhound, the bulldog, the Blenheim spaniel, etc., so unlike all wild Canidae, ever existed freely in a state of nature? It has often been loosely said that all our races of dogs have been produced by the crossing of a few aboriginal species. But by crossing, we can only get forms in some degree intermediate between their parents. And if we account for our several domestic races by this process, we must admit the former existence of the most extreme forms, as the Italian greyhound, bloodhound, bulldog. In the wild state, moreover, the possibility of making distinct races by crossing has been greatly exaggerated. There can be no doubt that a race may be modified by occasional crosses, if aided by the careful selection of those individual mongrels which present any desired character, but that a race could be obtained nearly intermediate between two extremely different races or species, I can hardly believe. Sir J. Seabright expressly experimentized for this object and failed. The offspring from the first cross between two pure breeds is tolerably, and sometimes, as I have found with pigeons, extremely uniform, and everything seems simple enough. But when these mongrels are crossed with one another, for several generations, hardly two of them will be alike. And then the extreme difficulty or rather utter hopelessness of the task becomes apparent. Certainly, a breed intermediate between two very distinct breeds could be got without extreme care and long continued selection. Nor can I find a single case on record of a permanent race having been thus formed. Formed naturally or in a man-made way. Okay, so this seems kind of like amusing and speculation rather than observation and data. Right. So now specifically on pigeons then. I don't actually need this, do I? I'm going to take this off. It's tickling my ears a bit too much. On the breeds of the domestic pigeon, believing that it is always best to study some special group, I have, after deliberation, taken up domestic pigeons. I have kept every breed which I could purchase or obtain, and have been most kindly favoured with skins from several quarters of the world, more especially by the Honourable W. Elliot from India, and by the Honourable C. Murray from Persia. Many treatises in different languages have been published on pigeons, and some of them are very important, as being of considerable antiquity. I have associated with several eminent fanciers, and have been permitted to join 2 of the London pigeon clubs. The diversity of the breeds is something astonishing. Compare the English carrier and the short-faced tumbler, and see the wonderful difference in their beaks, entailing corresponding differences in their skulls. The carrier, more especially the male bird, is also remarkable from the wonderful development of the carnunculated skin about the head, and this is accompanied by greatly elongated eyelids, very large external orifices to the nostrils, and a wide gape of mouth. The short-faced tumbler has a beak in outline almost like that of a finch, and the common tumbler has the singular and strictly inherited habit of flying at a great height in a compact flock, and tumbling in the air, head over heels. He loves his pigeons, doesn't he? The runt is a bird of great size, with long, massive beak and large feet. Some of the sub-breeds of runts have very long necks, others very long wings and tails, others singularly short tails. The barb is allied to the carrier, but instead of a very long beak, has a very short and very broad one. The pouter has a very much elongated body, wings and legs, and is enormously developed crop, which it glories in inflating, may well excite astonishment and even laughter. The turbit has a very short and conical beak, with a line of reversed feathers and down the breast, and it has the habit of continually expanding slightly the upper part of the esophagus. The Jacobin has the feathers so much reversed along the back of the neck that they form a hood, and it has, proportionally to its size, much elongated wing and tail feathers. The trumpeter and laughter, as their names express, utter a very different coo from the other breeds. The fantail has 30 or even 40 tail feathers, instead of 12 or 14. The normal number in all members of the great pigeon family, and these feathers are kept expanded, and are carried so erect that in good birds the head and tail touch, The oil gland is quite aborted. Several other less distinct breeds might have been specified. I think that's quite enough. He likes his pigeons. He's definitely a pigeon nerd. It reminds me of that character in John Wick. Who talks to John Wick with his pigeons. They're all warbling away. Alright, I don't think I'll muse on that any further. Let's move on. Let's move on to the next chapter. Not chapter, paragraph. Okay, in the skeletons of several breeds of pigeon, I'm assuming, the development of the bones of the face in length and breadth and curvature differs enormously. The shape, as well as the breadth and length of the ramus of the lower jaw, varies in a highly remarkable manner. The number of the caudal and sacral vertebrae vary, as does the number of the ribs. Oh, really? Together with the relative breadth and the presence of processes. The size and shape of the apertures of the sternum are highly variable. So is the degree of divergence and relative size of the two arms of the furcula. The proportional width of the gape of mouth, the proportional length of the eyelids, of the orifice of the nostrils, of the tongue, not always in strict correlation with the length of the beak, the size of the crop, and of the upper part of the esophagus, the development and abortion of the oil gland. Don't know what the oil gland is. The number of the primary wing and the caudal feathers, the relative length of wing and tail to each other and to the body, the relative length of leg and of the feet, the number of scotellae on the toes, the development of skin between the toes are all points of structure which are variable. The period at which the perfect plumage is acquired varies, as does the state of the down with which the nestling birds are clothed when hatched. The shape and size of the eggs vary. The manner of flight differs remarkably, as does in some breeds the voice and disposition. Lastly, in certain breeds, the males and females have come to differ to a slight degree from each other. Gosh, so just imagine he's got all these different breeds of pigeon, and then he's studying all these characteristics. No computer, so how is he collecting this data? He must have just like huge notebooks and just writing them all down. You love the hello there, Menra Gaming. I hope I've said it properly. I remember I said it incorrectly when he first came on. Have you read this book? This is my first reading, so I'm taking my time, pausing to muse and looking things up. It seems like he's kind of the style of his writing is kind of thinking out loud, but it seems to be like he's talking to other scientists. So he's mentioning other scientists every now and again, but he kind of expects you to know. And he's already mentioned things like genus and genera, species, but he hasn't defined them. So I guess you're expected to know what they are, and biological classification and taxonomy. So I've just been looking that up. So this kind of thing here, you're kind of expected to know. Yes, you've read it quite a lot, as you're an anthropologist. Aha! And it's inspired me so much. I've just read. No, well, at the moment I'm reading The God Delusion, but I came to that from reading The Selfish Gene, and The Selfish Gene was on my, someday I'm going to read this list. Like other books I've got, like Brief History of Time, is one of those books that's just like, I need to read that at some point. So last month I got around to reading The Selfish Gene, and a lot of his inspiration comes from here, and I thought, wow, this was the book that kind of blew religion out of the water by showing, here is the mystery solved. This is where we come from. We didn't just suddenly appear, we evolved. So I thought, right, I'm going to read this because I've never read it. How does he kind of formulate it? So I've decided to just read it aloud, because I tend to read aloud when I do read. But I thought I'd do it live as well. And have I read Richard Dawkins? I've read, yes, last month I read The Selfish Gene for the first time, and I'm about halfway through The God Delusion. I would like to read The Extended Phenotype and some of his other books, The Unweaving the Rainbow and The Blind Watchmaker. So I've got those kind of queued up. So I'm going to have a bit of a Dawkins season, I guess. I tend to read like that. I tend to choose an author and then just go through all of their works. So earlier, not this year, last year, I read a lot of Camus, and then I went through all of the Bronte sisters and read like a series of 7 or 8 of those books. Then I read Nikolai Gogol, so I just took the author, found an anthology, and then just worked my way through. So right now it's Dawkins. And I've been watching a lot of his talks on YouTube as well. Conversations with Neil deGrasse Tyson have been interesting. So that's where my inspiration for reading this has come from. Aside from it being on my one day I'll get round to reading it list, now it's like Dawkins saying, come on, you need to read this. This is like a turning point in the history of human thinking, I suppose. So, altogether, at least a score of pigeons might be chosen, which, if shown to an ornithologist, and he were told that they were wild birds, would certainly, I think, be ranked by him as well-defined species. Moreover, I do not believe that any ornithologist would place touch. The oil gland is quite aborted. Several other less distinct breeds might have been specified. The English carrier, the short-faced tumbler, the runt, the barb, the pouter, and fantail in the same genus. So he says genus, but he doesn't define it. More especially as in each of these breeds several truly inherited sub-breeds, or species, as he might have called them, could be shown him. Hang on. So genus is... Right, genus is above species. So it's a more... What's genus and genera? So the plural is genera. Okay. Getting it, bit by bit. I was planning to just look up everything, but it's going to take a long time, so... and just stopping to kind of muse on something I understand or maybe don't quite understand, and then deciding to move on or look it up. Okay, great as the differences are between the breeds of pigeons, I am fully convinced that the common opinion of naturalists is correct, namely, that all have descended from the rock pigeon, Columba livia. The rock pigeon, including under this term several geographical races or subspecies, which differ from each other in the most trifling respects. As several of the reasons which have led me to this belief are in some degree applicable in other cases, I will here briefly give them. If the several breeds are not varieties, and have not proceeded from the rock pigeon, they must have descended from at least 7 or 8 aboriginal stocks. For it is impossible to make the present domestic breeds by the crossing of any lesser number. How, for instance, could a pouter be produced by crossing 2 breeds unless one of the parent stocks possessed the characteristic enormous crop? The supposed aboriginal stocks must all have been rock pigeons, that is, not breeding or willingly perching on trees. But C. livia, Columba livia, with its geographical subspecies, only 2 or 3 other species of rock pigeons are known, and these have not any of the characteristics of the domestic breeds. Hence, the supposed aboriginal stocks must either still exist in the countries where they were originally domesticated and yet be unknown to ornithologists. And this, considering their size, habits, and remarkable characters, seem very improbable. Or they must have become extinct in the wild state. But birds breeding on precipices and good flyers are unlikely to be exterminated, and the common rock pigeon, which has the same habits with the domestic breeds, has not been exterminated even on several of the smaller British islets, or on the shores of the Mediterranean. Hence, the supposed extermination of so many species having similar habits with the rock pigeon seems to me a very rash assumption. So I guess he's making reference to whatever was current at the time, theories that were going around. Moreover, the several above-named domesticated breeds have been transported to all parts of the world, and therefore some of them must have been carried back again into their native country. But not one has ever become wild or feral, though the dovecot pigeon, which is the rock pigeon in a very slightly altered state, has become feral in several places. Again, all recent experience shows that it is most difficult to get any wild animal to breed freely under domestication. Yet, on the hypothesis of the multiple origin of our pigeons, it must be assumed that at least 7 or 8 species were so thoroughly domesticated in ancient times by half-civilized man, as to be quite prolific under confinement. I'm kind of not getting the difference between these different terms. So we've got a breed, a species, and variety. So the rock pigeon is like the granddaddy of all pigeons. That's what he's saying, right? Namely, that all have descended from the rock pigeon, Columba livia, including under this term several geographical races. So there's the rock pigeon. He is the granddaddy or the grandmummy, and then all the descendants become various other pigeons, and they spread on the shores of the Mediterranean. And some of them are breeding on precipices, and some are good flyers. But he says exterminated. I suppose he's meaning extinction. But it's clear he's very much a pigeon nerd, because he's expecting us to know a lot of pigeon breeds, pigeon behaviour. He's seriously into his pigeons. Taxonomical classification. Gosh, making my mouth dry, all this reading. All right. Let me just take this in. Hence, the supposed extermination of so many species having similar habits with the rock pigeon seems to me a very rash assumption. Moreover, the several above-named domesticated breeds have been transported to all parts of the world. So transported both by the pigeons themselves, I'm thinking, but also by humans. And therefore, some of them must have been carried back again to their native country. But not one has ever become wild or feral. Though the dovecot pigeon, which is the rock pigeon in a very slightly altered state, has become feral in several places. Okay. So we're looking at the descendancy of pigeons from the rock pigeon. All right. Now what? And I wish this was divided up into the sort of sub-chapters. An argument, as it seems to me of great weight and applicable in several other cases, is that the above specified breeds, though agreeing generally in constitution, habits, voice, colouring, and in most parts of their structure with the wild rock pigeon, yet are certainly highly abnormal in other parts of their structure. We may look in vain throughout the whole great family of Columbidae for a beak like that of the English carrier, or that of the short-faced tumbler or barb, for reversed feathers like those of the Jacobin, for a crop like that of the pouter, for tail feathers like those of the fantail. Hence, it must be assumed not only that half-civilized man succeeded in thoroughly domesticating several species, but that he intentionally or by chance picked out extraordinarily abnormal species, and further, that these species have since all become extinct or unknown. So many strange contingencies seem to me improbable in the highest degree. An argument, it seems to me, of great weight. Well, if it is of great weight, it seems to have passed me by, so I need to read this again. An argument, as it seems to me, of great weight, and applicable in several other cases. Great weight and applicable in several other cases is that the above specified breeds, though agreeing generally in constitution, habits, voice, colouring, and in most parts of their structure with the wild rock pigeon, yet are certainly highly abnormal in other parts. Okay. So it's similar to the rock pigeon for the most part, but then not so. We may look in vain throughout the whole great family of Columbidae for a beak like that of the English carrier, or that of the short-faced tumbler, for reversed feathers like those of the Jacobin. Okay, hence, here we go. So how is it applicable? Hence it must be assumed not only that half-civilized man succeeded in thoroughly domesticating several species. It must be assumed. Why must it be assumed? But that he intentionally or by chance picked out extraordinarily abnormal species. And further, that these very species have since all become extinct or unknown. I don't see how he's following from that. How must it be assumed not only that he picked it, but then they've become extinct? So he's assuming this happened. So half-civilized man domesticated these species, but then they've since become extinct. So many strange contingencies seem to me improbable in the highest degree. No. Not getting that on the second reading either. Alright, I think I'll not puzzle over it for too long, but maybe the next paragraph will shed some light on it. I've seen rock pigeon, so more about pigeons then. Hello, Stella Luminosa. Okay, so we're talking about wild animals and plants and cultivated or domestic animals and plants and how they differ. So in this case, we're focusing on pigeons and that all pigeons are descended from the rock pigeon. Let's see if I can remember. Columba livia. Okay. So there was something about the half-civilized man cultivating pigeons, but then those breeds have since become extinct. So I didn't quite understand, but I'm going to move on. Okay, so some facts in regard to the colouring of pigeons well deserve consideration. The rock pigeon is of a slaty blue and has a white rump. The Indian subspecies C. intermedia of Strickland having it bluish. The tail has a terminal dark bar, with the bases of the outer feathers externally edged with white. The wings have 2 black bars. Some semi-domestic breeds and some apparently truly wild breeds have, besides the 2 black bars, the wings checkered with black. These several marks do not occur together in any other species of the whole family. Now, in every one of the domestic breeds, taking thoroughly well-bred birds, all the above marks, even to the white edging of the outer tail feathers, sometimes concur perfectly developed. Moreover, when 2 birds belonging to 2 distinct breeds are crossed, neither of which is blue or has any of the above specified marks, the mongrel offspring are very apt suddenly to acquire these characteristics. For instance, I crossed some uniformly white fantails with some uniformly black barbs, and they produced mottled brown and black birds. Black pigeons. These again are crossed together, and one grandchild of the pure white fantail and pure black barb was of a beautiful blue colour, with the white rump, double black winged bar, and barred with white-edged tail feathers as any wild rock pigeon. Oh, he loves his pigeons. We can understand these facts on the well-known principle of reversion to ancestral characters, if all the domestic breeds have descended from the rock pigeon. But if we deny this, we must make one of the two following highly improbable suppositions. Either, firstly, that all the several imagined aboriginal stocks were coloured and marked like the rock pigeon, although no other existing species is thus coloured and marked, so that in each separate breed there might be a tendency to revert to the very same colours and markings. Or, secondly, that each breed, even the purest, has within a dozen, or at most within a score of generations, been crossed by the rock pigeon. I say within a dozen or 20 generations, for we know of no fact countenancing the belief that the child ever reverts to some one ancestor removed by a greater number of generations, in a breed which has been crossed only once with some distinct breed. The tendency to reversion to any character derived from such cross will naturally become less and less, as in each succeeding generation there will be less of the foreign blood. But when there has been no cross with a distinct breed, and there is a tendency in both parents to revert to a character which has been lost during some former generation, this tendency, for all that we can see to the contrary, may be transmitted undiminished for an indefinite number of generations. These two distinct cases are often confounded in treatises on inheritance. If he only knew about genetics. Frostbite. Hello there. So we are reading from The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, and this is chapter 1. So he's been talking about the difference between the wild or natural propagation of species and contrasting that with domestic plants and animals. And now we're focusing particularly on pigeons. So he's part of the London Pigeon Club in the mid-19th century. And he's very proud of being part of the London Pigeon Club. And he likes his pigeons. All right, so we're going to move on. So all pigeons have the ancestor of the rock pigeon. Shall I drop a space video, a short one? What is a space video? A video about space? Yes, you can if you want to. So I'm going to carry on with this. Lastly, the hybrids or mongrels from between all the domestic breeds of pigeons are perfectly fertile. The hybrids or mongrels from between all the domestic breeds of pigeons are perfectly fertile. I can state this from my own observations, purposely made on the most distinct breeds. What does he mean by most distinct breeds? Now, it is difficult, perhaps impossible, to bring forward one case of the hybrid offspring of two animals clearly distinct, being themselves perfectly fertile. Some authors believe that long-continued domestication eliminates the strong tendency to sterility. I didn't know that the domestication leads to sterility. From the history of the dog, I think there is some probability in this hypothesis, if applied to species closely related together, though it is unsupported by a single experiment. But to extend the hypothesis so far as to suppose that species, aboriginally as distinct as carriers, tumblers, pouters, and fantails now are, should yield offspring perfectly fertile, inter se, seems to me rash in the extreme. What seems rash? Some authors believe that long-continued domestication eliminates this strong tendency to sterility. Sounds like some kind of wives' tale that is shared among breeders. Okay. I wonder how much long is left. Yes, there's still a long way to go till we get to the end of the chapter. My God, it's already 2 hours. And we still have a long, long way to go. Variation under nature. Let's come back. Good. Okay, I think I'll just read instead of muse, because there's a long way to go. I think this is going to be a good, at least another hour. From these several reasons, namely the improbability of man having formerly got 7 or 8 supposed species of pigeons to breed freely under domestication, these supposed species being quite unknown in the wild state, and there becoming nowhere feral, these species having very abnormal characters in certain respects, as compared with all other Columbidae, though so like in most other respects to the rock pigeon, the blue colour and various marks occasionally appearing in all the breeds, both when kept pure and when crossed, the mongrel offspring being perfectly fertile. From these several reasons, taken together, I can feel no doubt that all our domestic breeds have descended from the Columba livia, with its geographical subspecies. Okay, so he's come to that conclusion. In favour of this view, I may add, firstly, that Columba livia, or the rock pigeon, has been found capable of domestication in Europe and in India, and that it agrees in habits and in a great number of points of structure with all the domestic breeds. Secondly, although an English carrier or short-faced tumbler differs immensely in certain characters from the rock pigeon, yet by comparing the several sub-breeds of these breeds, more especially those brought from distant countries, we can make an almost perfect series between the extremes of structure. Thirdly, those characters which are mainly distinctive of each breed, for instance the wattle and length of beak of the carrier, the shortness of that of the tumbler, and the number of tail feathers in the fantail, are in each breed eminently variable, and the explanation of this fact will be obvious when we come to treat of selection. Fourthly, pigeons have been watched and tended with the utmost care and loved by many people. They have been domesticated for thousands of years in several quarters of the world. The earliest known record of pigeons is in the 5th Egyptian dynasty. Look at that spelling of Egypt. About 3000 BC, as was pointed out to me by Professor Lepsius. And Mr. Birch informs me that pigeons are given in a bill of fare in the previous dynasty. In the time of the Romans, as we hear from Pliny, immense prices were given for pigeons. Nay, they are come to this pass that they can reckon up their pedigree and race. Pigeons were much valued by Akbar Khan in India about the year 1600. Never less than 20,000 pigeons were taken with the court. The monarchs of Iran and Turan, where's Turan, sent him some very rare birds, and continues the courtly historian, His Majesty, by crossing the breeds, which method was never practiced before, has improved them astonishingly. About this same period the Dutch were eager about pigeons, as were the old Romans. The paramount importance of these considerations in explaining the immense amount of variation which pigeons have undergone will be obvious when we treat of selection. We shall then also see how it is that the breeds so often have a somewhat monstrous character. It is also a most favourable circumstance for the production of distinct breeds, that male and female pigeons can be easily mated for life, and thus different breeds can be kept together in the same aviary. History of pigeons. I have discussed the probable origin of domestic pigeons. Okay, some sort of conclusion here. Yes, and then we've got selection next. I have discussed the probable origin of domestic pigeons at some yet quite insufficient length. Insufficient length, okay, because when I first kept pigeons and watched the several kinds, knowing well how true they bred, I felt fully as much difficulty in believing that they could never have descended from a common parent, as any naturalist could in coming to a similar conclusion in regard to the many species of finches, or other large groups of birds in nature. One circumstance has struck me much, namely... hello, pigeons. I missed all of that. I haven't got my earphones on. Thank you for following. Micro J Sang. Hello there. Who else followed? John Mezayarik. Fallen fried rice. I am hydrating. I need to, actually. So this is Darwin. So Charles Darwin. He is a complete pigeon nerd, it turns out. So that's what I've got so far, and he's been keeping pigeons, and he's part In the 19th century, he's part of the London Pigeon Club, and he's very proud of being part of the London Pigeon Club. So he's making all these comparisons between the different breeds of pigeons. But I think he's going to leave off pigeons now. Leo HD. Was there a raid or something? Now, where did you guys all come from? I've been so busy staring at the text, I haven't been looking at chat. What did I miss? I missed something, haven't I? I've missed something. What did I miss? Okay, I felt fully as much difficulty in believing that they could ever have descended from a common parent, as any naturalist could in coming to a similar conclusion in regard to the many species of finches, or any other large group of birds in nature. One circumstance has struck me much, namely, that all the breeders of the various domestic animals, and the cultivators of plants. Okay, we're starting to get more general now than just about pigeons, with whom I have never conversed, or whose treatises I have read, are firmly convinced that the several breeds to which each has attended are descended from so many aboriginal distinct species. Ask, as I have asked, a celebrated raiser of Hereford cattle, whether his cattle might not have descended from longhorns, and he will laugh you to scorn. I have never met a pigeon, or poultry, or duck, or rabbit fancier. There are rabbit fanciers. Oh, there was a second hydrate. Rabbit fanciers. My God. He disbelieves that the several sorts, for instance, a Ribston pippin or codlin apple, could ever proceed from the seeds of the same tree. Okay, I think I better put this back on, because I've missed chat now. Innumerable other examples could be given. The explanation, I think, is simple. From long continued study, there are strongly impressed within the differences between the several races, and though they well know that each race varies slightly, for they win their prizes by selecting such slight differences, yet they ignore all general arguments, and refuse to sum up in their minds slight differences accumulated during many successive generations. Slight differences accumulated. Here we're getting to the selection process. May not those naturalists who, knowing far less of the laws of inheritance than does the breeder, and knowing no more than he does of the intermediate links in the long lines of descent, yet admit that many of our domestic races have descended from the same parents. May they not learn a lesson of caution when they deride the idea of species in a state of nature being lineal descendants of other species? When they deride the idea of the species in a state of nature being lineal descendants of other species. There we go. So here he's kind of coming to the conclusions. So we've got the naturalist who's just observing, and then we've got the breeder who's just selecting, knowing far less of the laws of inheritance than does the breeder, and knowing no more than he does of the intermediate links in the long lines of descent, yet admit that many of our domestic races have descended from the same parents. May they not learn a lesson of caution when they deride the idea of a species in a state of nature being lineal descendants of other species? Okay, I think that's probably the end of pigeons now. My word. Selection. Let us now briefly consider the steps by which domestic races have been produced. Now, let me select selection. Select selection. So this is the title of the book, or not the title of the book, the subtitle, Natural Selection. So this is the definition. Let us now briefly consider the steps by which domestic races have been produced, either from one or from several allied species. Some little effect may perhaps be attributed to the direct action of the external conditions of life, and some little to habit, but he would be a bold man who would account by such agencies for the differences of a dray and a racehorse, a greyhound and bloodhound, a carrier and a tumbler pigeon. One of the most remarkable features in our domesticated races is that we see in them adaptation, not indeed to the animal's or plant's own good, but to man's use or fancy. Some variations useful to him have probably arisen suddenly, or by one step. Many botanists, for instance, believe that the fuller's teasel, with its hooks, which cannot be rivalled by any mechanical contrivance, is a variety of the wild Dipsacus, some plant, and this amount of change may have suddenly arisen in a seedling. So it has probably been with the Transpit dog, and this is known to have been the case with the Ancon sheep. But when we compare the dray horse and the race horse, the dromedary and the camel, the various breeds of sheep fitted either for cultivated land or mountain pasture, with the wool of one breed good for one purpose and that of another breed for another purpose, when we compare the many breeds of dogs, each good for man in very different ways, when we compare the game stock, so pertinacious in battle, with another breed so little quarrelsome, with everlasting layers which never desire to sit, with the bantam, so small and elegant, when we compare the host of agricultural, culinary, orchard and flower garden races of plants, most useful to man at different seasons and for different purposes, or so beautiful in his eyes, we must, I think, look further than to mere variability. We cannot suppose that all the breeds we suddenly produced as perfect and as useful as we now see them. Indeed, in several cases, we know that this has not been their history. The key in man's power of accumulative selection, nature gives successive variations. Man adds them up in certain directions useful to him, in the sense that he may be said to make for himself useful breeds. So here, yes. Yes, here we go. Here, the key is man's power of accumulative selection. Nature gives successive variation. He hasn't talked about it in this way so far, successive variation. Or he hasn't summed it up in this way. Man adds them up in certain directions useful to him. All right. I'm getting it. Now he's pulling all these threads together now. The great power of this principle of selection is not hypothetical. It is certain that several of our eminent breeders have, even with a single lifetime, modified to a large extent some breeds of cattle and sheep. In order fully to realize what they have done, it is almost necessary to read several of the many treatises devoted to this subject, and to inspect the animals. Breeders habitually speak of the animal's organization as something quite plastic, which they can model almost as they please. If I had space, I could quote numerous passages to this effect from highly competent authorities. Youatt, who is probably better acquainted with the works of agriculturists than almost any other individual, and who was himself a very good judge of an animal, speaks of the principle of selection as that which enables the agriculturist not only to modify the character of his flock, but to change it altogether. It is the magician's wand by means of which he may summon into life whatever form and mould he pleases. Lord Somerville, speaking of what breeders have done for sheep, says, "It would seem as if they had chalked out upon a wall a form perfect in itself, and then had given it existence." That most skilful breeder, Sir John Seabright, used to say, with respect to pigeons, that he could produce any given feather in 3 years, but it would take him 6 years to obtain head and beak. In Saxony, the importance of the principle of selection in regard to merino sheep is so fully recognized that men follow it as a trade. The sheep are placed on a table and are studied like a picture by a connoisseur. This is done 3 times at intervals of months, and the sheep are each time marked and classed, so that the very best may ultimately be selected for breeding. Pigeons and sheep. What English breeders have actually effected is proved by the enormous prices given for animals with a good pedigree, and these have now been exported to almost every quarter of the world. The improvement is by no means generally due to crossing different breeds. All the best breeders are strongly opposed to this practice, except sometimes among closely allied sub-breeds. And when a cross has been made, the closest selection is far more indispensable even than in ordinary cases. If selection consisted merely in separating some very distinct variety and breeding from it, the principle would be so obvious as hardly to be worth notice. But its importance consists in the great effect produced by the accumulation in one direction during successive generations of differences absolutely inappreciable by an uneducated eye. Differences for which I, for one, have vainly attempted to appreciate. Not one man in 1,000 has accuracy of eye and judgment sufficient to become an eminent breeder. If gifted with these qualities, and he studies his subject for many years and devotes his lifetime to it. With indomitable perseverance, he will succeed and may make great improvements. If he wants any of these qualities, he will assuredly fail. Few would readily believe in the natural capacity and years of practice requisite to become even a skillful pigeon fancier. Pigeons want to become famous? No! I should have to bring back Nightbot, I think. The same principles are followed by horticulturalists, but the variations here are often more abrupt. No one supposes that our choicest productions have been produced by a single variation from the aboriginal stock. We have proofs that this is not so in some cases in which exact records have been kept. Thus, to give a very trifling instance, the steadily increasing size of the common gooseberry may be quoted. We see an astonishing improvement in many florists' flowers. When the flowers of the present day are compared with drawings made only 20 or 30 years ago, when a race of plants is once pretty well established, the seed raisers do not pick out the best plants, but merely go over their seed beds and pull up the rogues, as they call the plants that deviate from the proper standard. With animals, this kind of selection is in fact also followed, for hardly anyone is so careless as to allow his worst animals to breed. So what they're called rogues. I thought they were... okay. Hello, Yosef! Can I join you? Yes, you can join me, because here's the book. You can read along. Gosh, I'm still on the first chapter. It's like 2.5 hours. I think I'm going all sparkly. I think I need to put my light on. There we go. Let's get rid of the sparkle. Okay, so we're looking at artificial selection as opposed to natural selection, and making the comparison between how nature kind of breeds animals and plants and how humans have through history domesticated certain animals and plants. There's been a lot about Darwin seems to be a bit of a pigeon nerd. He used to keep pigeons and documented the variations between pigeons. So, did I? Oh no, I missed this one. I've missed a paragraph. In regard to plants, there is another means of observing the accumulative effects of selection, namely, by comparing the diversity of flowers in the different varieties of the same species in the flower garden, the diversity of leaves, pods, or tubers, or whatever part is valued. In the kitchen garden, in comparison with the flowers of the same varieties, and the diversity of fruit of the same species in the orchard, in comparison with the leaves and flowers of the same set of varieties. See how different the leaves of the cabbage are, and how extremely alike the flowers. How unlike the flowers of the heart's ease are, and how alike the leaves, how much the fruit of the different kinds of gooseberries differ in size, colour, shape, and hairiness, and yet the flowers present very slight differences. It is not that the varieties which differ largely in some one point do not differ at all in other points. This is hardly ever, perhaps never, the case. The laws of correlation of growth, the importance of which should never be overlooked, will ensure some differences, but, as a general rule, I cannot doubt that the continued selection of slight variations, either in the leaves, the flowers, or the fruit, will produce races differing from each other, chiefly in these characters. Because, they're choosing based on, you might want bigger tomatoes, so you choose to continue that line. It may be objected that the principle of selection has been reduced to methodical practice for scarcely more than 3/4 of a century. It has certainly been more attended to of late years, and many treatises have been published on the subject. And the result, I may add, has been in corresponding degree rapid and important. But it is very far from true that the principle is a modern discovery. I could give several references to the full acknowledgement of the importance of the principle in works of high antiquity. In rude and barbarous periods of English history, choice animals were often imported, and laws were passed to prevent their exportation. The destruction of horses under a certain size was ordered, and this may be compared to the roguing of plants by nurserymen. The principle of selection I find distinctly given in an ancient Chinese encyclopedia. Explicit rules are laid down by some of the Roman classical writers. From passages in Genesis, it is clear that the colour of domestic animals was, at that early period, attended to. Savages now sometimes cross their dogs with wild canine animals to improve the breed, and they formerly did so, as is attested by passages in Pliny. The savages in South Africa match their draught cattle by colour, as do some of the Eskimo their teams of dogs. Livingstone shows how much good domestic breeds are valued by Negroes of the interior of Africa, who have not associated with Europeans. Some of these facts do not show actual selection, but they show that the breeding of domestic animals was carefully attended to in ancient times, and is now attended to by the lowest savages. It would indeed have been a strange fact had attention not been paid to breeding, for the inheritance of good and bad qualities is so obvious. I see. I love its 19th century turn of phrase. Look at the spelling of Eskimo. All right, so at the present time. So present time is it's like 1850. Okay, so at the present time, eminent breeders try by methodical selection, with a distinct object in view, to make a new strain or sub-breed superior to anything existing in the country. But, for our purpose, a kind of selection, which may be called unconscious, and which results from everyone trying to possess and breed from the best individual animals, is more important. Thus, a man who intends keeping pointers naturally tries to get as good dogs as he can, and afterwards breeds from his own best dogs. But he has no wish or expectation of permanently altering the breed. Nevertheless, I cannot doubt that this process, continued during centuries, would improve and modify any breed, in the same way as Bakewell, Collins, etc. By this very same process, only carried on more methodically, did greatly modify, even during their own lifetimes, the forms and qualities of their cattle. Slow and insensible changes of this kind could never be recognized unless actual measurements or careful drawings of the breeds in question had been made long ago, which might serve for comparison. In some cases, however, unchanged or but little changed individuals of the same breed may be found in less civilized districts, where the breed has been less improved. There is reason to believe that King Charles's spaniel has been unconsciously modified to a large extent since the time of that monarch. Some highly competent authorities are convinced that the setter is directly derived from the spaniel and has probably been slowly altered from it. It is known that the English pointer has been greatly changed with the last century, and in the case the change has, it is believed, been chiefly effected by crosses with the foxhound. But what concerns us is that the change has been effected unconsciously and gradually, and yet so effectually that, though the old Spanish pointer certainly came from Spain, Mr. Borrow, who is Mr. Borrow? Mr. Borrow has not seen, as I am informed by him, any native dog in Spain like our pointer. Okay. Selection. So he's defining selection. We're back to the rock pigeon. By a similar process of selection, and by careful training, the whole body of English racehorses have come to surpass in fleetness and size the parent Arab stock, so that the latter, by the regulations for the Goodwood races, are favoured in the weights they carry. Lord Spencer and others have shown how the cattle of England have increased in weight and in early maturity compared with the stock formerly kept in this country. By comparing the accounts given in old pigeon treatises of carriers and tumblers with these breeds as now existing in Britain, India, and Persia, we can, I think, clearly trace the stages through which they have insensibly passed, and come to differ so greatly from the rock pigeon. So here we get the crux. We can clearly trace the stages through which they have insensibly passed. If you had the drawings or photographs, which you didn't at the time, I guess drawings would have been it, but then going from one variety or one generation to the next, well, okay, Youatt. Who is Youatt? Youatt gives an excellent illustration of the effects of a course of selection, which may be considered and unconsciously followed insofar that the breeders could never have expected or even have wished to have produced the result which ensued, namely, the production of two distinct strains, the two flocks of Leicester sheep kept by Mr. Buckley and Mr. Burgess, as Mr. Youatt remarks, have been purely bred from the original stock of Mr. Bakewell, for upwards of 50 years. There is not a suspicion existing in the mind of anyone at all acquainted with the subject that the owner of either of them has deviated in any one instance from the pure blood of Mr. Bakewell's flock. And yet the difference between the sheep possessed by these two gentlemen is so great that they have the appearance of being quite different varieties. Where's my mouse? There's my mouse. If there exist savages so barbarous as never to think of the inherited character of the offspring of their domestic animals, savages, yet any one animal particularly useful to them, for any special purpose, would be carefully preserved during famines and other accidents to which savages are so liable, and such choice animals would thus generally leave more offspring than the inferior ones, so that in this case there would be a kind of unconscious selection. Unconscious selection going on by the savages. We see the value set on animals even by the barbarians of Tierra del Fuego, by their killing and devouring of their old women in times of dearth, as of less value than their dogs. Political correctness was not a thing back then in the mid-19th century. Okay. In plants, the same gradual process of improvement through the occasional preservation of the best individuals, whether or not sufficiently distinct to be ranked as their first appearance as distinct varieties, and whether or not two or more species or races have become blended together by crossing, may plainly be recognized in the increased size and beauty which we now see in the varieties of the heart's-ease, rose, pelargonium, dahlia, and other plants, when compared with the older varieties or with their parent stocks. No one would ever expect to get a first-rate heartsease or dahlia from the seed of a wild plant. No one would expect to raise a first-rate melting pear from the seed of a wild pear, though he might succeed from a poor seedling growing wild, if it had come from a garden stock. The pear, though cultivated in classic times, appears, from Pliny's description, to have been a fruit of very inferior quality. I have seen great surprise expressed in horticultural works at the wonderful skill of gardeners in having produced such splendid results from such poor materials, but the art, I cannot doubt, has been simple, and as far as the final result is concerned, has been followed almost unconsciously. It has consisted in always cultivating the best-known variety, sowing its seeds, and when a slightly better variety has chanced to appear, selecting it, and so onwards. But the gardeners of the classical period, who cultivated the best pear they could procure, never thought what splendid fruit we should eat. Though we owe our excellent fruit, in some small degree, to their having naturally chosen and preserved the best varieties they could anywhere find. So we're saying that the pears that we have now didn't just descend, they were chosen by those gardeners of the classical period. So, thank you to those gardeners. A large amount of change in our cultivated plants, thus slowly and unconsciously accumulated, explains, as I believe, the well-known fact that in a vast number of cases we cannot recognize, and therefore do not know, the wild parent stocks of the plants which have been longest cultivated in our flower and kitchen gardens. If it has taken centuries or thousands of years to improve or modify most of our plants up to their present standard of usefulness to man, we can understand how it is that neither Australia, the Cape of Good Hope, nor any other region inhabited by quite uncivilized man has afforded us a single plant worth culture. It is not that these countries, so rich in species, do not by a strange chance possess the aboriginal stocks of any useful plants, but that the native plants have not been improved by continued selection up to a standard of perfection comparable with that given to the plants in countries anciently civilized. In regard to domestic animals kept by uncivilized man, it should not be overlooked that they almost always have to struggle for their own food. What, they weren't fed? At least during certain seasons. Okay. And in two countries, very differently circumstanced individuals of the same species, having slightly different constitutions or structure, would often succeed better in one country than in the other, and thus by a process of natural selection. Here we go, is the first mention of it. And thus by a process of natural selection, as will hereafter be more fully explained, two sub-breeds might be formed. This, perhaps, partly explained what has been remarked by some authors, namely, that the varieties kept by savages have more of the character of species than the varieties kept in civilized countries. Let's call them wild people, the wildlings. If you watched Game of Thrones, the northern people are called the wildlings. But, yeah, same kind of connotation, I guess, as savage. I think savage had the connotation of being cannibal. On the view here given of the all-important part which selection by man has played. So, selection by man, and we've got natural selection. Natural selection has only just been mentioned for the first time. It becomes at once obvious how it is that our domestic races show adaptation in their structure or in their habits to man's wants or fancies. We can, I think, further understand the frequently abnormal character of our domestic races, and likewise their difference being so great in external characters and relatively so slight in internal parts or organs. Man can hardly select, or only with much difficulty, any deviation of structure except such as it is externally visible. And indeed, he rarely cares for what is internal. What about foie gras? That's the liver. He can never act by selection, except on variations which are first given to him in some slight degree by nature. No man would ever try to make a fantail till he saw a pigeon with a tail developed in some slight degree in an unusual manner, or a pouter, till he saw a pigeon with a crop of somewhat unusual size, and the more abnormal or unusual any character that was when it first appeared, the more likely it would be to catch his attention. So he could only sort of breed what he thought was possible. So he couldn't just like make something up. I guess he can now with genetic manipulation. But yeah. So he sees like bigger teeth or bigger horns or thicker fur and goes, right, we'll go with that one. But to use such an expression as trying to make a fantail is, I have doubt, in most cases utterly incorrect. The man who first selected a pigeon with a slightly larger tail never dreamed what the descendants of that pigeon would become through long-continued, partly unconscious and partly methodical selection. Perhaps the parent bird of all fantails had only 14 tail feathers, somewhat expanded, like the present Java fantail, or like individuals of other and distinct breeds, in which as many as 17 tail feathers have been counted. Perhaps the first pouter pigeon did not inflate its crop much more than the turbit now does the upper part of its esophagus, a habit which is disregarded by all fanciers, as it is not one of the points of the breed. Okay. Nor let it be thought that some great deviation of structure would be necessary to catch the fancier's eye. He perceives extremely small differences, and it is in human nature to value any novelty, however slight, in one's own possession. Nor must the value which would formerly be set on any slight differences in the individuals of the same species be judged of by the value which would now be set on them after several breeds have once fairly been established. Many slight differences might, and indeed do now, arise amongst pigeons, which are rejected as faults or deviations from the standard of perfection of each breed. The common goose has not given rise to any marked varieties. Hence the Toulouse and the common breed, which differ only in colour, that most fleeting of characters, have lately been exhibited as distinct at our poultry shows. Can you imagine this guy kind of going along writing down things in his notebook? Look at this pigeon. It's got a bigger tail. I think these views further explain what has sometimes been noticed, namely, that we know nothing about the origin or history of any of our domestic breeds, but, in fact, a breed, like a dialect of a language, can hardly be said to have had a definite origin. In fact, a breed, like a dialect of a language, can hardly be said to have had a definite origin. It can't. A man preserves and breeds from an individual with some slight deviation of structure, or takes more care than usual in matching his best animals and thus improves them. And the improved individuals slowly spread in the immediate neighbourhood. But as yet they will hardly have a distinct name, and from being only slightly valued, their history will be disregarded. when further improved by the same slow and gradual process, they will spread more widely and will get recognized as something distinct and valuable. Aha, now I'm getting the idea of distinct. And will then probably first receive a provincial name. Okay, so there is a difference. So there is this subtle difference, but is not far enough removed from what's already there to be then called distinct. That is a separate, this is a separate breed, this is a different dialect. The similarity is so subtle that it's kind of the same. In semi-civilized countries, with little free communication, the spreading and knowledge of any new subbreed will be a slow process. As soon as the points of value of the new subbreed are once fully acknowledged, the principle, as I've called it, of unconscious selection will always tend, perhaps more at one period than at another, as the breed rises or falls in fashion, perhaps more in one district than in another, according to the state of the civilization of the inhabitants. Slowly to add to the characteristic features of the breed, whatever they may be, but the chance will be infinitely small of any record having been preserved of such slow, varying, insensible changes. Wow. It's kind of hard to imagine. Like he's writing this in 1844. And when you think about it, it's like, what, 160 years ago? 170 years ago? And to imagine parts of the world that are uncivilized now in 2021, where people don't have recording equipment, where people aren't able to communicate with each other. It's just it sort of gives the impression of this era being much, much further back, like 300-400 years ago. But it just shows how far we've come in this time, in just 170 years. He's talking of savages and uncivilized, half-civilized. There aren't places like that anymore. I must now say a few words on the circumstances favourable or the reverse to man's power of selection. A high degree of variability is obviously favourable, as freely giving the materials for selection to work on. Not that mere individual differences are not amply sufficient, with extreme care, to allow of the accumulation of a large amount of modification in almost any desired direction. But as variations manifestly useful or pleasing to man appear only occasionally, the chance of their appearance will be much increased by a large number of individuals being kept, and hence this comes to be of the highest importance to success. On this principle, Marshall has remarked, with respect to the sheep of parts of Yorkshire, that as they generally belong to poor people, and are mostly in small lots, they never can be improved. On the other hand, nurserymen, from raising large stocks of same plants, are generally far more successful than amateurs in getting new and valuable varieties. The keeping of a large number of individuals of a species in any country requires that the species should be placed under favourable conditions of life. so as to breed freely in that country. When the individuals of a species are scanty, all the individuals, whatever their quality may be, will generally be allowed to breed, and this will effectually prevent selection. But probably the most important point of all is that the animal or plant should be so highly useful to man, or so much valued by him, that the closest attention should be paid to even the slightest deviation in the qualities or structure of each individual. Unless such attention be paid, nothing can be effected. I have seen it gravely remarked that it was the most fortunate that the strawberry began to vary just when gardeners began to attend closely to this plant. No doubt the strawberry had always varied since it was cultivated, but the slight varieties had been neglected. As soon, however, as gardeners picked out individual plants with slightly larger, earlier, or better fruit, and raised seedlings from them, and again picked out the best seedlings and bred from them, then there appeared, aided by some crossing with distinct species, those many admirable varieties of the strawberry which have been raised during the last 30 or 40 years. So there were good strawberries back in the mid-19th century then. In the case of animals with separate sexes, facility in preventing crosses is an important element of success in the formation of new races. At least in a country which is already stocked with other races. In this respect, enclosure of the land plays a part. Wandering savages savages again, or the inhabitants of open plains rarely possess more than one breed of the same species. Pigeons can be mated for life, and this is a great convenience for the fancier, or thus many races may be kept true, though mingled in the same aviary, and this circumstance must have largely favoured the improvement and formation of new breeds. Pigeons, I may add, can be propagated in great numbers, and at a very quick rate, and inferior birds may be freely rejected, as when killed they serve for food. On the other hand, cats, from their nocturnal rambling habits, cannot be matched. And although so much valued by women and children, we hardly ever see a distinct breed kept up. What about men? I like cats. Such breeds as we do sometimes see are almost always imported from some other country, often from islands. Although I do not doubt that some domestic animals vary less than others, yet the rarity or absence of distinct breeds of the cat, the donkey, the peacock, goose, etc., may be attributed in main part to selection, not having been brought into play. In cats, was he watching cat videos back then? Didn't have YouTube in the 19th century. In cats, from the difficulty in pairing them. In donkeys, from only a few being kept by poor people, and little attention paid to their breeding. In peacocks, from not being very easily reared, and a large stock not kept. In geese, from being valuable for only two purposes, food and feathers, and more especially from no pleasure having been felt in the display of distinct breeds. Oh, we have Siamese cats, don't we? Persian cats. My God, the last paragraph. Where's my mouse pointer? It's so small. To sum up on the origin of our domestic races of animals and plants, I believe that the conditions of life, from their action on the reproductive system, are so far of the highest importance as causing variability. I do not believe that variability is an inherent and necessary contingency under all circumstances, with all organic beings, as some authors have thought. The effects of variability are modified by various degrees of inheritance and of reversion. Variability is governed by many unknown laws, more especially by that of correlation of growth. Something may be attributed to the direct action of the conditions of life. Something must be attributed to use and disuse. The final result is thus rendered infinitely complex. In some cases, I do not doubt that the intercrossing of species, aboriginally distinct, has played an important part in the origin of our domestic productions. When in any country several domestic breeds have once been established, their occasional intercrossing, with the aid of selection, has, no doubt, largely aided in the formation of new sub-breeds. But the importance of the crossing of varieties has, I believe, been greatly exaggerated, both in regard to animals and to those of plants, which are propagated by seed. In plants, which are temporarily propagated by cuttings, buds, etc., the importance of the crossing both of distinct species and the varieties is immense. For the cultivator here quite disregards the extreme variability both of hybrids and mongrels. What's the difference? And the frequent sterility of hybrids. But the cases of plants not propagated by seed are of little importance to us, for their endurance is only temporary. Over all these causes of change, I am convinced that the accumulative action of selection, whether applied methodically and more quickly, or unconsciously and more slowly but more efficiently, is by far the predominant power. It puts power in capital letters, capitalized. The turn of phrase is so different to what we might read nowadays, and the sentences, my God, very long-winded. So you kind of lose your thread by the end of it. Like here. In cats, like he's already divided up this sentence. Although I do not doubt that some domestic animals vary less than others, yet the rarity or absence of distinct breeds of the cat, the donkey, the peacock, the goose, etc., may be attributed in main part to selection not having been brought into play in cats, from the difficulty in pairing them, in donkeys from only a few being kept by poor people, and little attention paid to their breeding, in peacocks. Hang on. Although I do not doubt... So he's talking about variations, but he's gone off on a tangent about different animals. Food and feathers, more especially, from no pleasure having been felt in the display of distinct breeds. So, modern writing uses much shorter sentences, I think. So, What was the point of this? Was it all just about pigeons? No. He did mention natural selection once. So let's go back to the kind of chapter table of contents. This is like a mini table of contents that the clearly distinct. So it keeps coming back to this distinct, and he did define that as like when there's enough the variation of a variety then is enough to warrant a difference. A lot about pigeons. So that was his main specific example, that everything is derived or descended from the rock pigeon. But here, so we had causes of variability, effects of habit. I don't remember that being explained very well. Correlation of growth. That was more kind of hearsay. Inheritance, yes. Character of domestic varieties. Difficulty of distinguishing between varieties and species. I don't think that was really defined as to what is a species and what is a variety. Origin of domestic varieties from one or more species. So that was discussed as to whether the lineage is just like one line. So you got the rock pigeon, and then that has a son or daughter, then leads to the next generation and so on. But then he was talking about crossbreeding and how some of the previous generations have then become extinct. So there's no way easily to be able to trace back. Domestic pigeons, their differences in origin, and I think a big part of the chapter was devoted to that, because he's a massive pigeon nerd, it turns out. Then principle of selection anciently followed its effects. So that was kind of interesting, how it was comparing what he's calling savage or unconscious selection. So unlike modern breeders who are selecting certain characteristics of the plant or the animal and then choosing that particular breed. So here we got another term. So we've got a variety, we've got a species, we've got a breed, and then how did they relate to each other? But it seems that a species is different, which I'm not quite understanding, but I am understanding this idea of the incremental change per generation, and that the changes can be small, but every now and again you get like quite an odd characteristic which is not observed in the other ones. So you suddenly get a blue feather, or like a longer beak or something. But you won't see that unless you've got lots and lots of them. So principle of methodical and unconscious selection. So I don't think the word methodical is really used. But unconscious, that was all the savages adopting dogs and making dogs into more domestic dogs, but then they weren't breeding them methodically as we might do now, like the King Charles Spaniel. But yeah, I mentioned this already, but the fact that he's put a kind of table of, or introduction of the ideas that he's planning to discuss in the chapter as a kind of mini table of contents, I think it would have been good if he'd actually divided the chapter under these headings, and then you could see like sub-chapters, and could have stuck to the point rather than sort of musing about it in this way. But still, he did get the ideas across. Let's read the first chapter again and see. And sometimes this is, especially with like when I was studying, so this is not a novel. So when I was studying, sometimes a good way to get like an overview of the text would be to just read like this, not really try and understand it, then read the last like couple of paragraphs of the chapter, and then come back and read the first one, and then suddenly like a lot of it will just, you'll get penny dropping moments, or like a long news article. That's kind of a useful way to read it. You read just like the fuck you. You just read the kind of subheadings. SEAL Team 6 killed you, Osama. Oh man, we got some trolls. Nice. Unknown origin. I don't know if he mentioned this even. Unknown origin of our domestic productions. He does call it production, so he's using terms that he's not defining. That kind of annoys me as well. So I think he sort of started off by saying, right, these are the terms I'm going to use, this is how I'm going to define them, and then it makes it clear, this is the terminology, this is how it's being used. So yeah, we've got to keep going back to its mid-19th century, and he's addressing other scientists of the time. Circumstances favourable to man's power of selection. So this is more to do with the breeders, both the animals and the gardeners. Yeah. Okay, so I think I'm gonna close this out by reading the first chapter, the first paragraph again, and see if we can glean a little more understanding from it, having read the whole chapter, which has taken 3 hours. My God. Hey, what are these guys? Can we... You like dragons? You been to Sorcon? When we look to the individuals of the same variety or sub-variety of our older cultivated plants and animals. So with the pigeons, he was going back to the rock pigeons. When we look to the individuals of the same variety or the sub-variety of our older cultivated plants and animals, one of the first points which strikes us is that they generally differ much more from each other than do the individuals of any one species or variety in a state of nature. When we reflect on the vast diversity of the plants and animals which have been cultivated and which have varied during all ages under the most different climates and treatment, I think we are driven to conclude. So he's already making a conclusion here in the first paragraph. I think we are driven to conclude that this greater variability is simply due to our domestic productions, having been raised under conditions of life not so uniform as, and somewhat different from, those to which the parent species have been exposed under nature. There is also, I think, some probability in the view propounded by Andrew Knight, and we still don't know who Andrew Knight is, that this variability may be partly connected with excess of food. It seems pretty clear that organic beings must be exposed during several generations to the new conditions of life to cause any appreciable amount of variation. It seems pretty clear that organic beings must be exposed during several generations to new conditions of life to cause any appreciable amount of variation, and that when the organization has once begun to vary, it generally continues to vary for many generations. No case is on record of a variable being ceasing to be variable under cultivation. No case is on record of a variable being ceasing to be variable under cultivation. Our oldest cultivated plants, such as wheat, still often yield new varieties. Our oldest domesticated animals are still capable of rapid improvement or modification. Okay, so we've come kind of full circle. Blimey. 3.5 hours. So it took that long to get there. I thought it was going to be like 2 hours-ish, but yeah. This was a long chapter. Yeah, this was a long chapter, so it took a while. It took a very long while. He's from Peckham. Where did you guys all come from? Now, at the beginning, I was just reading a chapter and then kind of musing about it, and then I was looking, because he's assuming quite a lot, because he's using vocabulary, like scientific vocabulary, that he's just expecting you to know. So he's using things like genus and genera, and I've heard the words, but you know, so I've been stopping to look stuff up so I can understand it better and rereading bits. So that is why it took so long. So I think for chapter 2, yeah, I'll probably just read. But it's a shame he didn't kind of... Hello there. Donielt, thank you for the follow. Gosh, you guys are... You guys are talking amongst yourselves. I don't know what is going on. Chat is going so fast. I can't keep up with it. Okay. So, I wanted to do this. I had no idea how it was going to go, but I just felt like doing it, so I did it. And yeah. Hydrate. I will hydrate. And then I think I'm going to play some Borderlands. Mincy. More water. Oh yeah. Who is Andrew Knight? We're expected to know. Who is this guy, Andrew Knight? No idea. Pecknarm. Skull the dog. I can't keep up with chat, you guys. Wait, aren't you in zone 2? Peckham. Is there life in Peckham? Is South London, though? It's not Peckham, no. But yeah, it is South London, innit? South London. Right. So, got to the end of the chapter. Variation under domestication. Loving it. Loving the trolling. Okay. I think I need to move. I've been sitting here for 3.5 hours. So, I enjoyed that. So, I think I'm going to finish this. And then I'm going to come back and play a bit of Borderlands. So I want to carry on with my Sal build I was doing yesterday. What time is it? 2:45. Yeah, I'm going to do that. God, show me the gloves. They're my gloves. It's cold here. I bet you're a mad chess player. I am plus Chade. I haven't done that in ages. He's part of OFB. How many of you are there? There's Minstead, Donny Elt, Gothy OC. Take the gloves off. Take them off. Come Manchester, I'll murder you. More. This is the best trolling I've seen. Yo, chill. Right. I think I'm done for this stream. So, yeah, as I said, I'm going to have a break and then I'm going to come back and play some Borderlands 2. Yes. Okay, guys. So, thank you for being here. I'm actually enjoying the trolling. Haven't had much trolling, so that's kind of fun. But, yeah, I need to do something else for a bit. Bloody mad. So that was Chapter 1 of The Origin of Species by Charles Dickens. 47 hours. Yeah. I think I'm only just going to have a short break, maybe just like 15 minutes or so. But I don't want to just do like put my be right back screen up for that long. And then, yeah, I'll update the, whatchamacallit, stream title and all that. Change my scenes and stuff. Anyway, thank you guys for being here. I need to move because my legs have gone stiff. And then I'll do a bit of Borderlands 2. No! You just arrived! That's what usually happens with a raid. Just as you're about to finish is like massive raid. Well, sorry raid guys. I'm out of here. See ya!